A bear cub appeared at his window every night. The reason will break your heart. The forest was unusually quiet that night. Daniel, a middle-aged man who had chosen the solitude of a small wooden cabin deep in the mountains, sat by the fire with only the crackling flames for company. Winters in these parts were long and unforgiving, and he had learned to embrace the silence. But that night, the silence was broken by a sound he couldn't ignore, a faint scratching against the glass window. At first, he thought it was the wind, maybe a loose branch brushing against the frame. But when he turned his head, his heart froze. Just outside the window, two dark eyes stared back at him, wide, round, and glistening with both fear and desperation. It was a bear cub, tiny, trembling, and clearly alone. Daniel didn't move at first. He knew wild animals rarely approached humans unless something was terribly wrong. The cub pressed its little paw against the glass, almost as if it were knocking. His breath caught in his chest. Why would a bear cub come here, to him, at night? Slowly, Daniel rose and walked to the window. The cub didn't run. Instead, it tilted its head, a soft whimper escaping its throat. The sound pierced Daniel's heart in a way he hadn't expected. For a brief moment, he saw not a wild creature, but a lost child in need. Cautiously, he opened the door and stepped outside. The cub took a hesitant step back, but didn't flee. It looked at him with pleading eyes, shivering in the cold night air. Daniel crouched low, keeping his distance, and whispered softly, "It's all right, little one. You're safe here." That was the first night. The first visit. He didn't know it yet, but the cub would return again, and again, until the truth behind its nightly visits broke his heart. The next morning, Daniel half convinced himself that the strange encounter had been nothing more than a dream. But when the sun dipped below the mountains that evening and darkness crept back into the forest, he heard it again, the soft scratching at his window. There it was. The same tiny cub, standing on its hind legs, pressing its paws against the glass. Its nose fogged the window as it peered inside, eyes wide with expectation. This time, Daniel didn't hesitate. He went to his cupboard, broke off a piece of bread, and set it just outside the door. The cub was cautious. It sniffed the air, glanced at him nervously, and only after several moments did it creep forward to snatch the bread before retreating a safe distance. Daniel stood still, watching. The cub devoured the food in seconds, its hunger undeniable. Night after night, the visits continued. Sometimes the cub would arrive early, sometimes well past midnight, but it always came. Daniel began preparing small scraps of food in advance, bits of fruit, leftover stew, whatever he had to spare. Each time, the cub's approach became a little less fearful, a little more trusting. Daniel found himself waiting for it, listening for the faint rustle of leaves outside his cabin. The silence of the mountains didn't feel as heavy anymore. Instead, he felt a strange sense of purpose, as if the cub had chosen him for a reason he didn't yet understand. Still, one question gnawed at his mind. Where was its mother? Cubs this young rarely survived alone. The forest was dangerous, filled with predators and hunters. And yet, every night, this small creature braved the darkness just to reach his window. As Daniel watched the cub finish a piece of apple one evening, the realization began to take shape. This wasn't a random visit. It was a cry for help. And Daniel knew he couldn't ignore it much longer. By the third week, Daniel could no longer deny it. Something was terribly wrong with the cub. Each night, he noticed new signs that told a painful story. The cub's ribs were beginning to show beneath its thin layer of fur, its movements slower, weaker. When it lifted its paw to the glass, Daniel saw scratches and tiny cuts, as though it had been wandering through rough terrain without guidance. One night, the cub arrived limping. Daniel's chest tightened at the sight. It sat outside his window, whimpering softly, almost too tired to stand. Daniel quickly rushed to the door with food, this time a bowl of warm milk and bread soaked in broth. The cub sniffed it cautiously, but soon ate as if it hadn't seen a proper meal in days. As Daniel watched, an ache grew in his heart. Cubs this young should be with their mothers, learning to forage, staying close under protective care. This little one had none of that. Instead, it came alone, night after night, searching for safety at a stranger's cabin. Lying awake that night, Daniel replayed the visits in his mind. The first frightened knock, the hunger in its eyes, the desperate return every evening. He couldn't shake the image of its trembling body pressed against the window, as if pleading silently for him to understand. The more he thought about it, the clearer the picture became. Something tragic had happened, something that had left the cub motherless. Bears didn't abandon their young without reason. The thought of poachers or hunters crept into Daniel's mind, leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. He turned to stare at the flickering fire, his fists clenched. "Poor little soul," he whispered to the silence. "What have they done to you?" For the first time in years, Daniel felt the sting of helplessness. The cub wasn't just hungry, it was grieving, lost and broken. And somehow, it had chosen him to be the one to notice. The nights grew colder, but the cub never stopped coming. Each time Daniel opened his door, he found himself speaking to it as if it were a child. "There you are," he would murmur softly, setting down food. "I was starting to wonder if you'd forgotten me." The cub no longer darted away the moment he appeared. Instead, it waited, watching him with cautious but growing trust. Some evenings, after eating, it lingered near the porch, curling into a small ball of fur before eventually disappearing back into the forest. Daniel began to expect its visits as part of his routine. He chopped wood faster, cooked extra portions, even lit a lantern outside so the cub wouldn't stumble in the dark. And when he spotted that familiar little face at the window, his heart softened in a way he hadn't felt in years. Loneliness had been Daniel's constant companion since he chose a quiet life in the mountains. But now, with the cub's nightly visits, the silence felt less suffocating. He realized that he looked forward to those knocks on the window, those wide eyes searching for him. One night, when the cub finished its meal and lingered unusually close, Daniel dared to extend his hand. The cub froze, eyes fixed on him. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, cautiously, the cub sniffed his fingers. It didn't run. Daniel smiled faintly. "We're friends now, aren't we?" he whispered. That tiny act of trust marked a turning point. No longer was it just a wild creature coming for food. Something deeper was forming, a fragile, unlikely bond between a grieving cub and a man who thought he'd long forgotten how to care. It was on a stormy evening that the truth finally revealed itself. Daniel was sitting by the fire when the now familiar scratching at his window echoed through the cabin. But this time, something was different. The sound was weaker, almost desperate. He rushed to the door and found the cub trembling, soaked from the rain, its tiny body shivering uncontrollably. "Come on, little one," Daniel whispered, carrying a blanket to the porch. He wrapped the cub gently and set down food, but to his surprise, the cub didn't eat. Instead, it tugged at the blanket, whimpering, then turned toward the forest. Daniel hesitated. The storm raged outside, but the cub's cries were insistent. For the first time, instead of waiting at his door, it wanted him to follow. Heart pounding, Daniel grabbed his lantern and coat and stepped into the rain. The cub led him through the dripping undergrowth, stumbling but determined. After nearly half an hour, they reached a clearing. There, Daniel froze. Beneath the charred remains of a massive tree lay the unmistakable outline of a full-grown bear, the cub's mother. Her lifeless body was half hidden beneath fallen branches, scars of a forest fire still etched in the earth around her. Daniel's throat tightened as the reality sank in. The cub hadn't just been hungry. It had been mourning. Each night, it returned to him because it had nowhere else to go, no one else to turn to. The little bear whimpered, nudging its mother's still form, then curled into a ball beside her, rain pouring down on its fragile frame. Daniel knelt beside it, his chest heavy with sorrow. In that moment, he understood the true weight of the visits. This cub had carried its grief alone, and by scratching at his window, it had been asking him, begging him to see, to understand, to care. Daniel placed a hand gently on the cub's back. "You don't have to be alone anymore," he whispered. "Not while I'm here." The storm raged on, but in that clearing, something shifted. The cub had lost a mother, but perhaps it had found a protector. The morning after the storm, Daniel awoke to find the cub curled up on his porch, still wrapped in the blanket he had given it. For the first time since those nightly visits began, the little bear hadn't vanished back into the forest. It had chosen to stay. Daniel made a quiet decision then and there. He couldn't replace the cub's mother, but he could give it a chance: safety, food, warmth, and something that resembled love. The days turned into weeks, and a new rhythm took hold. Daniel built a small shelter near the edge of his cabin, a place the cub could retreat to whenever it wished. He gathered berries, cooked hearty meals, and even carved a wooden bowl just for it. Slowly, the cub grew stronger. Its eyes, once clouded with sadness, began to shine with a spark of curiosity. Sometimes, Daniel would catch it playing clumsily in the meadow, tumbling over itself in the grass. Other times, it would follow him as he chopped wood or tended to the garden, always close, always watching. The silence that once haunted Daniel's cabin now felt alive, filled with the soft sounds of paws on wood, little growls, and the warmth of companionship. But Daniel knew he couldn't keep the cub forever. One day, it would have to return to the wild, to live as nature intended. And when that time came, he hoped it would go not as a broken orphan, but as a strong bear who had known kindness in a world that had been so cruel. Standing at his porch one evening, watching the cub chase fireflies in the fading light, Daniel whispered with a faint smile, "You saved me too, little one." And in that simple truth, both man and bear found a new beginning.